Hi everyone, I hope you're doing okay today. This is a video I wanted to make because a lot of clients, but people I talk to, generally speaking, are talking about being diagnosed, not just as children, but as adults with ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADD or ADHD, depending on what language you use or where you're from. I'm sure it's different in different countries. But what's the connection with anxiety? Is it just anxiety? What's going on with it? So that's why I wanted to address it here, because some people can get confused by it. It can be a barrier towards recovery or being happy with anxiety, recovering from anxiety to get happy. It can be very difficult to distinguish between the two, at least according to the literature. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video, but primarily, what is the missing link when we think about anxiety? And is it the same missing link for ADHD? That's the core message I want to discuss here. So I'm just going to be referring to just the information I've found through a simple Google that aggregates a lot of different information from different sites. So my whole channel is about anxiety. So if you want to know what anxiety is, how to recover from it, go to the Anxiety Cure series. If you've got ADHD or you've been told you've got it, then that actually just might help you. Maybe you have anxiety instead of ADHD, or maybe it's the same thing, but we'll get into that. But watch the Anxiety Cure series because it may help regardless. But that's what I mean when I already address anxiety. So in this video, I'm going to focus on ADHD, the similarities, maybe some differences, and go from there to help you demystify what ADHD is and what is the missing link in terms of the way I see people or health professionals dealing with it or not dealing with it, and potentially being quite unhelpful when it comes to helping their clients or patients who have it. So what is ADHD? So it's, inattention or hyperactivity. So the symptoms that they describe, if again, this is just through an aggregate search on Google, is, fidgeting, feeling restless, difficulty sitting still, constantly running or being on the go, talking excessively. So there's lots of energy in the system, unable to concentrate and focus. You can't wait your turn. You're jumping in with others, ahead of others in terms of speaking in conversations. Perhaps there's more risk-taking behavior. Acting on impulse without thinking about consequences. That could be the hyperactive impulsivity that they're talking about here. It can lead to impatience, mood swings, verbal outbursts, frustration, presumably, poor decision making, etc., etc. We might become hyper focused, at least according to this, if we have ADHD, really focused on something, and you get completely absorbed in it, neglecting all other responsibilities. So, in order to get diagnosed with ADHD, there is no sort of brain scan that most people would do or anything like that. You simply have to answer a series of questions and give yourself some sort of rating in terms of how often, if at all, rarely, never, sometimes, often, very often, that you experience these symptoms. And there's about, depending on which scale survey you do, there's about 18 questions on the one that I've found, which is from Novo Psych. So I'm not quite sure where they're based. But the questions are, I won't go through them all, but for example, how often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization? How often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations? How often do you feel overactive or compelled to do things like you're driven by a motor? How often do you misplace or have difficulty finding things at home? How often are you distracted by activity or noise around you? How often do you feel restless or fidgety, etc., etc.? So the key word here is, how do you feel? So they're asking you, how do you feel? And presumably, if you answer on the highest scale for this, then you will get some sort of diagnosis of ADHD. So what is the point of a diagnosis? Presumably, you're getting a diagnosis because however you're feeling is not serving you in some form. It's leading to some sort of frustration, fear, agitation, anger. Perhaps it's affecting relationships, how you perform at work, at school, depending on where you're at. But what the definitions don't really do, they don't really address And if you know my stuff, you know what I'm going to say: nervous system sensitization. So when you look at the definitions, people talk about it as a neurodevelopment disorder that's lifelong. A lot of people will talk about the brain only. They take a neck up approach to it in terms of how you think. I was speaking to some people recently in terms of these people who I both just met randomly have ADHD, and they talk about how it affects them. And I was asking them lots of questions. And one of the people said, it's my executive function. She said it's her executive function. So she just has no motivation, or she's hyper focused, and she was playing with all sorts of different medication to figure out what would help. But she was very agitated and frustrated with the whole scenario. So if you've got any of these symptoms, but it's not bothering you, there's no issue, then there is no issue. So presumably people get a diagnosis if they believe there is some sort of suffering going on. The same with anxiety. Now, with anxiety, you could argue there's more fear involved. Maybe there's hesitation, fear of symptoms, fearful thoughts, etc., then which may not be as present in ADHD. It just might be more impulsivity launching into life. But there's some sort of difficult energy going on. So I would argue, where is the mention of nervous system sensitization? Because a lot of these symptoms are exactly the same for anxiety. So we have short-term memory loss with anxiety. We have trouble concentrating, trouble finding motivation. Sometimes we have the obsessive thinking and compulsions, etc., etc. Now, you might argue that when we cross the threshold, which I talk about in other videos, so look at the anxiety pressure cooker video, the stress temperature video where I talk about the threshold, when our sensitization builds up to a point where we cross the threshold and become highly anxious, which can happen for people, with anyone really, which might happen for people who have anxiety and ADHD. Maybe they're the same thing, we don't know yet. Hard to tell, hard for people to tell. But it becomes more obvious that it's anxiety or your nervous system is tired. But I wonder, for ADHD, this inability to sit still, to concentrate, to focus, or this hyper focus where you're blocking everything out, there's some sort of agitation there. And to my mind, nervous system sensitization, it's not talked about. We can be sensitized in many different ways. We can be sensitized in relatively high functioning. We can be sensitized, not cross the threshold where then our overactive flight or fight is kicking in, so we're in a more fearful state. You might argue that many of the ADHD symptoms that are described are just nervous system sensitization or agitation before we cross the threshold, and some people don't, and so we sort of feel that it's just our brain. I'm just wired this way. It's just my executive function, which means I can't focus, or I hyper focus, or whatever. But no one really talks in terms of any strategies to help people with it. People get strategies to help with anxiety, but not to help self-regulate, slow down, calm the nervous system, deal with the discomfort and the suffering. If you want to recover from anxiety, you have to move through and be okay with the discomfort. If you want to change your habits around ADHD, I would argue, in terms of the work I've done with clients, you have to move through the discomfort. Now, if I'm having trouble sitting in a classroom, sitting at work all day for 8 hours, it might not be a problem. I mean, as human beings, are we really designed to stay in one spot for 8 hours and not be frustrated, tired, annoyed, agitated? Most people will experience that. If it's more than normal, or it's affecting your inability to work, you might have to start to move through that discomfort. If you feel it's just an executive issue in your brain, executive function issue in your brain, you're just going to think, well, that's just the way I am, and therefore the only way to help me function in this world is medication. Whereas if we start to use the tools I talk about for anxiety, a lot of people find that their symptoms of ADHD melt away, or they become a lot more easy to understand. They can get more focus back, their nervous system feels calmer, if they're starting to float, allow, accept, etc., do all the things from an anxiety perspective. Even with ADHD, even if most of their symptoms, there's not fear around them. But having said that, people are getting a diagnosis, there's some sort of problem. It's not like this is just the way I am and I'm perfectly happy and functioning. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing a psychiatrist or psychologist or being referred to see one. Maybe it's people around those suffering with those who, have symptoms that would correlate to a diagnosis, at least according to here about ADHD, that mean that they get sent to get some sort of diagnosis. So again, none of the literature that I see really talks about nervous system sensitization in a more meaningful and helpful way or a way out of it. I can only tell you anecdotally from the work I do with clients that the ADHD issues, the agitation, often calm down or disappear altogether when they're doing the work around anxiety. Recovering from anxiety. So in some ways, when the sensitization gets to a point where they cross the threshold and the flight or flight's active, so there's a lot more fear involved with their symptoms, they actually have more reason to really focus on recovery because life becomes so uncomfortable that they have no choice but to try and find a way through it. Obviously, we can have different things to do. We can get the medication, which just suppresses, which it does for both ADHD or anxiety, or tries to manage or dampen down symptoms or control symptoms, but that obviously has side effects. And then after we've been on medications for a while, which one's worse? So again, all these questions about ADHD are to do with how you feel, and how you feel, like anxiety, is all determined by your nervous system and the amount of nervous system sensitization and tension in your system that leads to feelings of fear, worry, agitation, compulsions, feeling you can't wait, you can't be patient, you have to jump in. You get hyper-focused on something and can't let something go to perhaps the detriment of other things. Again, all very similar. When we think about ADHD, or at least the literature, it's talking about some sort of lifelong neurodevelopment dysfunction, which to my mind feels really unhelpful, particularly when you get a diagnosis by simply answering questions. There's no brain scan, there's no blood tests to understand your brain, your chemical balances within the brain or anything like that. It's just a questionnaire. So I think potentially a lot of people with ADHD have just got an agitated nervous system. And I know through the work I do that allowing it, understanding it, learning to move through the discomfort can be a great tool to potentially not only help with the symptoms, but potentially even recover from it the same way I talk about from an anxiety perspective. I hope that's useful. If you've got any questions or any experiences that you would like to share around this topic, please put them in the comments, as I think it's one that perhaps needs to be addressed a bit more. All the best.